The old man stepped out of the Robben Island prison gates. It was a beautiful day in Cape Town with a clear blue sky, fluffy white clouds, and a gentle breeze blowing. The old man took a deep breath and smiled. After 27 years in prison, he was finally free. As he made his way down the prison steps, he could feel the weight of all those years lifting off his shoulders. He had served his time, and now it was time to start a new chapter in his life. But what would that chapter look like? The old man thought back to the day he'd been sentenced to prison. He was just a young man then, full of dreams and aspirations. But one bad decision had changed everything. He'd been convicted for a crime he didn't commit and had been sentenced to 27 years in prison. All these years later, he was still innocent, but he wasn't going to let that ruin his future. He had too much to look forward to. He remembered the taste of freedom, the feeling of the wind in his hair as he drove down the open road. He could almost hear the sound of birds chirping and the laughter of children playing. It had been so long since he'd experienced these things, but he was determined to make up for lost time. When he first arrived at Robben's Island, he'd been full of anger and resentment. How could this have happened to him? What was he supposed to do now? But over the years, he'd come to terms with his fate. He'd made the best of a bad situation and had even found some happiness in the most unlikely of places. He'd befriended a fellow inmate who taught him how to cook delicious meals with just a few simple ingredients. Together, they'd concocted all sorts of culinary delights, from fried rice to pasta dishes to even homemade pizzas. The old man smiled as he thought back to those days. It was amazing what you could do if you put your mind to it. He'd also found solace in the prison library, where he devoured books on every subject imaginable. He'd learned about history, science, philosophy, religion, everything. It was like a whole new world was opening up to him, and he couldn't believe he'd been missing out on all this knowledge for so many years. But now it was time to move forward. The old man knew that he couldn't dwell on the past. He had to focus on the present and what lay ahead. As he walked down the street, he could feel the eyes of people on him. Some were curious, others were judgmental. But he didn't care. He was free, and that's all that mattered. He hailed a taxi and told the driver to take him to the nearest supermarket. It had been so long since he'd been in a supermarket. He couldn't believe the selection of goods. There were so many things he'd forgotten even existed. He picked up a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, some cheese, and a carton of eggs. The old man paid for his groceries and took them home. His house was small but cozy. He had a bedroom, a kitchen, a living room, and a bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was enough for him. He unpacked his groceries and settled in. The old man was so happy to be home. He could finally relax and enjoy his freedom. He opened the fridge and took out the milk and cheese. He poured himself a glass of milk and took a bite of cheese. It was the best cheese he'd ever tasted. The old man had always loved cheese. When he was a young man, he'd worked at a cheese factory. It was hard work, but he was good at it. He knew all the different types of cheese and how to handle them. He'd even won an award for being the fastest cheesemaker in the factory. But when the crime had happened, he'd had to leave the factory and all his dreams behind. Now, years later, he was finally able to pursue his passion again. He wanted to go to Pretoria. He heard they had the best cheese there. He could still remember how excited he used to get as a young boy when his father would take him to the markets in Pretoria and buy him little pieces of cheese to try. He'd never forgotten that feeling, and he wanted to experience it again. So the old man decided to go to Pretoria to find the best cheese in South Africa. He got into his car and drove out of town. The old man felt the wind in his hair as he sped down the open road. He could see the other cars passing by, but he didn't care. He was focused on the road ahead and the taste of freedom that filled his mouth. He passed through small towns and villages, each one more charming than the last. He saw people going about their daily lives, families picnicking in parks, children playing, couples strolling hand in hand. It was wonderful to see all this life and activity after so many years of being cooped up in a prison cell. The old man continued on until he reached Pretoria. It was a bustling city with tall buildings and busy streets. But he wasn't fazed. He knew exactly where he was going. He drove to the market and parked his car. He couldn't believe his eyes. There were so many different stalls selling all kinds of goods. He wandered around, taking in the sights and sounds. He saw fresh produce, flowers, spices, meats, cheeses, everything. But his eyes were only for the cheese. He went from stall to stall, tasting samples, asking questions, learning about different varieties. He tried soft cheeses, hard cheeses, aged cheeses, even some unusual ones. Finally, he found it. The perfect cheese. It was a cheddar cheese, sharp and creamy with a hint of spice. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of in a cheese. He bought the cheese and took it back to his car. He couldn't wait to try it. As he drove away from the market, the old man smiled. He'd found his perfect cheese. He could finally rest easy. The old man drove home. It had been a long journey, but he was happy to be going home. He had his cheese, and that was all that mattered. When he got home, he unpacked his cheese and put it in his fridge. He couldn't wait to dig in. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat down to enjoy his prize. The cheese was everything he'd hoped it would be. It was sharp and creamy and the perfect amount of spice. The old man ate slowly, savoring each bite. He closed his eyes and let the flavor explode on his tongue. It was the best cheese he'd ever tasted. After finishing his cheese, the old man poured himself another glass of wine. He felt tired from the day's journey, so he decided to go to bed. He lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He could hear the crickets chirping outside and the wind blowing through the trees. It was peaceful. He closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the old man woke up feeling refreshed. He got out of bed and went to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down to plan his next move. He didn't want to go back to prison, but he also didn't feel ready to start a new life. He needed more time to adjust. That's when he had the idea to go back to Bloemfontein. He missed his family and friends there. Maybe they could help him adjust to life outside of prison. The old man packed up his things and got in his car. He drove out of Pretoria and onto the highway. As he drove, he thought about all the changes that had occurred in his life. He'd been through so much, but he had survived. And now, he was free. He looked forward to seeing his family and friends again. After a long drive, the old man's car pulled into his driveway. He got out of the car and walked up to his front door. He took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened, and there stood his sister, her face breaking into a wide smile. The old man had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. He embraced his sister, tears of joy streaming down his face. She was his only living relative, and she'd been there for him through thick and thin. The old man told his sister about his plans to start a new life in Bloemfontein. She was supportive and offered to help him settle in. The old man accepted her offer, and soon he was unpacking his belongings in his childhood home. It was strange to be back here, he thought, but in a good way. The old man spent the next few days catching up with his friends and family. They were all so happy to see him and eager to hear about his life in prison. One day, while walking through the town center, the old man saw a sign advertising a cheese shop. He decided to check it out. He walked in and was met with the sight of hundreds of different types of cheese. There were soft cheeses, hard cheeses, aged cheeses, even some unusual ones. The old man knew he had found his new passion. With the help of his family and friends, the old man opened a successful cheese shop. He became known throughout the town for his knowledge and passion for cheese. People from all over came to visit his shop and sample his wares. Years passed, and the old man looked back on his life with a sense of contentment. He had been through so much, but he had survived, and now he was living his dream. He had his perfect cheese, his family and friends, and a new life full of possibilities. The old man smiled. Life was good.